We carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. We think of them as distant cousins. But family reunions in the Paleolithic were brutal. At Krapina Cave in Croatia, the floor was littered with fragmented remains. For decades, scientists argued about what happened there. Was it a burial? Was it a conflict? Now, thanks to modern microscopic analysis, we know the truth. The cut marks on those bones match the marks found on processed deer. Basically, our ancestors were targeted, and the reason why is the most disturbing detail of all. Breaking the bones of the outsiders. When we look back at the timeline between 300,000 and 40,000 years ago, we want to see heroes. But the soil at Goyet Cave in Belgium does not care about our feelings. It only holds the truth. This site dates back to between 41,000 and 45,000 years ago. What researchers found there hands down destroys the idea of the noble savage. They recovered 101 human bone fragments. But these were not bodies laid to rest with flowers and respect. These remains were treated exactly like the reindeer and horse bones found in the same layer of dirt. The analysis is startlingly clear. The bones show distinct cut marks. These marks come from stone tools slicing through muscle to get to the bone. But it gets worse. The bones were fractured. They were intentionally opened. Why? To get to the marrow inside. In the Paleolithic era, fat was gold, and the marrow of a human thigh bone is packed with calories. But here is the catch. The victims were not old or sick people who passed away naturally. The forensic data paints a tragic picture. The remains belonged to 4 adults or adolescents, 1 child who was between 6.5 and 12.5 years old, and 1 neonate, a newborn baby. Statistically, finding this specific group of deceased individuals in one spot from natural causes is almost impossible. You do not just have 4 healthy adults and a kid pass away at the exact same time in the same cave unless something violent happened. This was a targeted event. And get this, the people who utilized them did not just stop at nutrition. They used the victims' bones as tools. They call them retouchers. Basically, they took the leg bones of the people they just processed and used them to sharpen their flint tools. Imagine using the bone of your rival to sharpen the knife you use to hunt. That is a level of utility that chills you to the bone. The isotope analysis of the bones revealed the final twist. The victims had the same diet as the locals, but they were from a different group. They were outsiders. This is what scientists call exocannibalism. They were not utilizing their friends out of respect. They were hunting non-locals to eliminate the competition. But while Goyet shows us the hunger, another cave reveals a ritual that makes even less sense. Now let's move south to Croatia. The Krapina cave site is one of the most debated crime scenes in prehistoric archaeology. Here, the ground was packed with hundreds of hominin bones. For a long time, experts were arguing back and forth. Was this a conflict? Was it a ritual? Or was it just nutrition? The bones at Krapina show cut marks, just like at Goyet. But the pattern is slightly different. Some early theories suggested they were accessing the cranium. That is the classic horror trope, right? But the modern analysis says, not exactly. The cuts on the skulls do not line up with extraction. Instead, it looks like they were defleshing the bodies. Basically, they were stripping the organic material off the bones. The big question is why? If you are starving, you utilize whatever you can find. But here is the crazy part. The geological data from Krapina shows that these events happened during a warm period. The environment was rich. There were plenty of deer, bison and rhinos. They were not starving. There was no famine. So, why process a body if you have plenty of venison walking around outside? This points to something cultural, something ritualistic. But do not get too comfortable thinking this was just a funeral practice. Post-processing marks on the bones show that after the people were processed, carnivores, like cave lions or wolves, chewed on the leftovers. This implies the bones were tossed aside after the humans were done with them. It is a messy, confusing picture. However, the evidence from another site, Moulin-Guercy in France, settles the debate for that location. Going back 100,000 years, the Neanderthals there left zero doubt. The processing patterns on the humans were identical to the processing patterns on the red deer found inches away. There was no ritual there. It was strictly nutritional. This breaks the romantic idea that this behavior is only a last resort. For these groups, other humans were just another source of protein on the landscape. It was practical, it was harsh, and it was normal. Neanderthals were tough, but when Homo sapiens arrived, the violence became much more precise and terrifying. It is easy to blame the Neanderthals for being primitive, but what about us? What about Homo sapiens? Well, the data shows we were just as dangerous. Actually, we might have been worse because we had better weapons. Let's look at Jebel Sahaba in Sudan. This site is between 12,000 and 14,000 years old. It is often called the first evidence of organized warfare. Archaeologists found 58 skeletons here, and the condition of these bodies is a nightmare. Almost half of them had projectile points, stone arrowheads or spear tips, embedded in their bones. Others had healed fractures from clubbing. This was not a one-time fight. These people lived in a constant state of fear. The Nile floods were causing resource scarcity, and the competition for land turned deadly. But here is the catch. It was not just warriors fighting warriors. The graves included women and children. Everyone was a target. This was total war. Now, jump back to Europe, to the El Sidron cave in Spain. This site gives us a glimpse of the interaction between the species. We found jagged Neanderthal bones here. But the tools found with them? They were made by Homo sapiens. The details are gruesome. The mandibles, the jawbones, show cut marks on the inside. Why cut the inside of a jaw? There is only one reason: to remove the tongue. In many hunting cultures, the tongue is considered a delicacy. It is high in fat and easy to consume. Finding Neanderthal jawbones with the tongue surgically removed by stone tools tells us exactly where they stood in the food chain. To the sapiens moving into Europe, the Neanderthals were competitors, but they were also prey. This wasn't just a fight for territory, it was an extermination. The presence of exocannibalism at these sites confirms that utilizing the enemy was a standard post-battle procedure. It sent a message, it fed the tribe, and it permanently removed the threat. Eating the enemy was one thing, but the weapons they used to do it changed history forever. The arms race, why brute force lost to ballistics. We need to talk about the gear. You cannot understand the violence of the Pleistocene without understanding the tools involved. For over 100,000 years, Neanderthals and Sapiens were locking horns across the frozen landscapes of Europe and the Middle East, but the fight was never fair. It was an asymmetrical war determined by physics, engineering, and ballistics, and the outcome was decided not by who was stronger, but by who could strike from the farthest distance. To understand why the Neanderthals eventually lost, you have to look closely at how they lived and how they hunted. Neanderthals were biological tanks. They possessed thicker bones, barrel chests, and an immense muscular density that shames modern athletes. To fuel this massive engine, they needed approximately 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day just to survive. Their hunting strategy evolved directly around this physiology because they were built for power, not efficiency. Their main weapon was the heavy thrusting spear. These were not disposable items. They were masterpieces of primitive engineering, featuring thick wooden shafts tipped with broad, heavy stone points made using the Levallois technique. These points were glued on with birch tar, a primitive adhesive that required complex heating processes to manufacture, representing one of the first industrial chemical processes in history. But despite the craftsmanship, the design had a fatal flaw, which was its weight. To use a Neanderthal spear effectively, you have to be right next to your target. We are talking about grabbing distance, or what paleontologists call contact hunting. You have to jam the spear through the ribs of a woolly rhino or a mammoth while the animal is thrashing around in a panic. The forensic data proves this was a logistical nightmare. A study by Eric Trinkhaus and Thomas Berger analyzed the trauma patterns on Neanderthal skeletons and found a shocking correlation where the injuries on Neanderthals match the injury patterns of modern rodeo riders. They had head trauma, crushed chests, and broken arms because they were literally wrestling their food to death. Against a mammoth, that is brave, but against a sapiens war party, it is a death sentence because if you miss your thrust, you are gone before you can reset your stance. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, brought something terrifyingly new to the party, and that was range. We were weaker and lighter, meaning if a Neanderthal grabbed a sapiens, the sapiens broke. So we invented ways to eliminate targets from outside the death zone. It started with microliths found in South Africa at sites like Pinnacle Point, where researchers found heat-treated stone bladelets dating back 71,000 years. These are tiny razor-sharp stone flakes designed to be hafted onto light projectile shafts, marking the birth of complex ballistics. Then came the atlatl, or spear thrower, which is the piece of technology that effectively ended the war. The atlatl is a stick about 2 feet long with a hook on the end that holds the butt of a light, flexible spear or dart. It acts as a lever, effectively extending the length of the thrower's arm and multiplying the force. The physics are brutal because a hand-thrown spear has an effective range of maybe 20 to 30 yards if you are strong, but an atlatl dart can fly over 100 yards with lethal accuracy. The dart flexes like a spring upon release, storing and releasing elastic energy, so when it hits, it strikes with the velocity of a modern compound bow. This changed the geometry of the battlefield completely. A Neanderthal had to close the gap to 10 feet to reach you, whereas a sapiens could eliminate the Neanderthal from 50 feet away, from behind a tree, or from a ridgeline. We turned combat into a shooting gallery where the enemy could not even reach us. This isn't just speculation because the bones tell the story. The most damning piece of evidence comes from the Zagros Mountains in Iraq, at the Shanidar Cave, which is the resting place of Shanidar III, a Neanderthal male who died roughly 50,000 years ago. Shanidar III has a peculiar wound on his 9th rib, a sharp, deep cut that partially healed, meaning he survived the initial attack but likely passed away weeks later from complications. The forensic analysis of this wound is chilling and reveals the weapon. Duke University anthropologist Stephen Churchill conducted ballistics experiments to replicate this injury using pig carcasses, which have similar rib density to Neanderthals, and stabbed them with various weapons. When they used a heavy thrusting spear, the force required to cut the rib shattered the surrounding bone, creating massive trauma inconsistent with Shanidar III. However, when they used a light projectile thrown from a distance, the results were a perfect match. The kinetic energy was high enough to puncture the chest wall and collapse his lung, creating a pneumothorax, but low enough that it didn't shatter the rib into powder, which is the signature of a low-mass, high-velocity projectile. The angle of the wound is the key because it entered at about 45 degrees downward. Shanidar III was standing, while his attacker was likely crouching or standing at a distance. This was a drive-by attack, Stone Age style. A sapiens hunter spotted Shanidar III, launched a projectile from a safe distance, and faded back into the landscape without the Neanderthal ever touching his attacker. He probably suffered for days, struggling to breathe as his lung filled with fluid before he finally passed away. This technological gap allowed sapiens to push into new territories and systematically dismantle the competition using hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. We could harass Neanderthal groups from a distance, wounding their hunters, and since a wounded Neanderthal is a burden on the clan because they can't hunt and consume resources, injuring key members allowed sapiens to starve them out without ever fighting a pitched battle. Furthermore, our weapons allowed us to steal their food by taking down game from a distance, stripping the environment of prey before the Neanderthals could get close enough to use their thrusting spears. We outgunned them and outcompeted them in a slow, methodical displacement driven by superior engineering. But weapons were not the only way they hurt each other. Some scars on the bones reveal a darker, personal cruelty. Not all violence was about war or food. Some of it was personal. Skeletal traumas give us a front-row seat to interpersonal brutality. Take a look at the Marber Man skull found in China. It is about 130,000 years old. This individual took a massive blow to the head with a blunt object, a club or a heavy stone. The bone was crushed in. But here is the crazy part. He survived. The bone healed. This tells us two things. One, someone in his group tried to eliminate him with extreme prejudice. Two, his group took care of him while he healed. It is a mix of aggression and compassion that is confusingly human, But then you look at Cioclovina Cave in Romania, roughly 33,000 years ago. Here we find sapien skulls with very specific fractures. Forensic scientists reconstructed the blows. The attackers were likely using a club, and based on the angle of the impact, the attackers were face-to-face with the victims. And get this detail. The angles suggest the attackers were left-handed. This level of forensic detail puts you right in the room when the fight happened. This was not a stray arrow. This was a brawl. In Wadi Kubania in Egypt 20,000 years ago, we see healed spear wounds on skeletons. These people were walking around with pieces of stone embedded in their bodies. They were living in a rough neighborhood, but the most disturbing pattern involves women. Across Paleolithic and Neolithic sites, archaeologists find a disproportionate number of female skulls with depression fractures. These are non-lethal blows to the head. This suggests a pattern of domestic conflict or abduction-based violence. It forces us to accept that the good old days were incredibly violent. The evolutionary models used to suggest that being a brave warrior helped you get a mate. But modern studies on tribes like the Waorani show that the fierce warriors who eliminate the most enemies actually make poor fathers and often pass away young in feuds. The violence we see in the bones, the blunt force trauma, the healed parry fractures on forearms from blocking blows, shows a society where physical safety was never guaranteed. The violence wasn't just physical. Genetic evidence hints at a disturbing reality regarding how the species mixed. So, knowing that our ancestors hunted, utilized and crafted tools from the bones of their rivals, do you think violence is written into our DNA, or can we escape it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Smash that like button and subscribe for part 2. But here's the catch. If you think prehistoric violence was just about two warriors fighting for honor, you are looking at the wrong data. We have to travel to Kenya, to a site called Nataruk. This place is 10,000 years old. Today, it is a dry, scrubby landscape near Lake Turkana. But 10,000 years ago, it was a lush, fertile lagoon. It should have been a paradise. Instead, archaeologists found a crime scene that changed everything we thought we knew about hunter-gatherers. They uncovered the remains of 27 individuals. And get this, none of them were buried. In a normal prehistoric site, you find bodies arranged carefully, maybe with some beads or tools. That shows respect. It shows grief. At Nataruk, the bodies were scattered. They were left exactly where they fell. They were covered by the sediment of the lagoon, frozen in their final moments. This was not a cemetery. It was a site of mass fatality. The forensic analysis of these 27 skeletons is gruesome. The injuries were not accidental. They show extreme blunt force trauma to the heads. Someone struck their skulls with heavy stones. But they also found projectile wounds. Sharp weapons were driven into their bodies with massive force. One skeleton had a small obsidian blade embedded directly in the skull. And here is where the forensic details get interesting. Obsidian is a volcanic glass. It is sharper than surgical steel. But obsidian is not found naturally right next to Nataruk. It is a trade item. It comes from outside the local area. This tells us exactly who the attackers were. They were not neighbors settling a dispute. They were outsiders. They were a raiding party equipped with high-quality foreign weapons. They came with a plan. The position of the bodies tells the rest of the story. Some were found face down. Others were found with their knees tucked up. This suggests they were falling while fleeing or cowering in fear. What most people don't realize is that for decades, scientists argued that war was a modern invention. They thought organized violence only started when we built cities and farms. Nataruk destroys that theory hands down. These were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They had no cities. They had no banks. But they had war. And it wasn't just the men who suffered. The attackers did not discriminate. The skeletons included men, women, and children. The goal was not to win a fight. The goal was to erase the group entirely. But among the 27 bodies at Nataruk, there is one specific victim whose condition reveals a level of cruelty that is hard to comprehend. Basically, the tragedy at Nataruk gets focused when you look at individual cases. Let's talk about one specific woman found at the site. The archaeologists catalogued her carefully, noting the position of her limbs. Her hands were not by her sides. They were crossed in a very specific way. The wrists were together. The angles of the radius and ulnar bones suggest they were held tight. The conclusion is chilling. She was restrained. She was tied up before she passed away. This changes the narrative completely. This was not just a chaotic battle where stray arrows hit people. This was a capture scenario. She was immobilized. She was helpless. And that's putting it lightly. The forensic examination revealed she was pregnant. In the pelvic area, researchers found the tiny, fragile bones of a fetus. She was carrying a child, likely close to term. Imagine the scene. A pregnant woman, hands tied, kneeling or sitting by the edge of the lagoon. The attackers did not show mercy. The evidence shows she was eliminated intentionally. Her remains were found mixed with the others, discarded without ceremony. This specific detail, the restraint, is crucial. It implies a period of control. The attackers had time, they had dominance. They tied her up, perhaps to interrogate, perhaps to torment, or perhaps to take her with them before deciding to end her life. This aligns with the darker theories about prehistoric raids. Often the objective was not just resources, it was people. But something went wrong, or the plan changed, and the result was total extermination. The Nataruk site also shows victims with crushed knees. Why crush a knee? To stop someone from running. It is a tactical injury. If you break the legs of the runners, you can deal with them at your leisure. This level of calculated cruelty, binding pregnant women, smashing knees with clubs, reveals a psychological dark side to Homo sapiens that has been there for at least 10,000 years. We are capable of immense cooperation, yes, but we are also capable of methodical elimination of the helpless. While Nataruk shows us the end of a life, the genetic data from other sites suggests that for some women, survival meant a fate that was arguably just as traumatic. The genetic invasion. So, here's the deal with our DNA. If you are of non-African descent, you carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. For a long time, pop science articles treated this as a quirky fact. They painted a picture of prehistoric romance. They imagined Neanderthals and Sapiens meeting in the forests of Europe and falling in love. But the archaeological context suggests something much darker. We have to look at how this DNA got there. Genetic admixture, the mixing of genes, happens when two populations mate. But in the context of the violence we have just discussed, the consumption of rivals, the spear wounds, the massacres, it is extremely unlikely these were consensual unions. The patterns of violence against women in the Paleolithic era were systemic. When one group raided another, the men were often eliminated, like at Nataruk, but the women were often taken. This is a pattern we see in historical warfare and tribal conflicts throughout history. The 1 to 4% is likely the result of abduction and coercion. Theories regarding Neanderthal extinction often point to assimilation, but assimilation is a polite word. If Sapiens warriors raided a Neanderthal camp, eliminated the males with their superior ranged weapons, the throwing spears and atlatls we discussed in Part 1, and took the females, that is not romance. That is conquest. Genetic studies on the Y chromosome support this. We see very little Neanderthal Y chromosome DNA in modern humans. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son. The absence of it suggests that Neanderthal men were not successfully reproducing with Sapiens women. However, we do see the mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA markers. This asymmetry strongly hints that the gene flow was primarily from Neanderthal women into Sapiens groups. And get this, the physical differences would have been stark. Neanderthals were robust, with heavy brows and immense physical strength. Sapiens were gracile and taller. The social dynamics of these interactions are impossible to know for sure, but the biological evidence of coerced interbreeding fits the violent landscape we see in the bones. This admixture was likely a byproduct of domination. We carry the genes of the survivors, but those survivors probably endured focused aggression to pass those genes on. The genetic data is abstract, but when we look at the skulls of women from this period, the evidence of mistreatment becomes physical and undeniable. We need to talk about the depression fractures. In bioarchaeology, a depression fracture is a dent in the skull caused by a blunt object. It does not break the skin or end the life immediately, but it leaves a permanent mark on the bone. When researchers look at skulls from the Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, they notice a disturbing trend. A disproportionate number of these fractures are found on female skulls. It's not that simple, though. You might think maybe they were fighting in wars too. And yes, women fought. But the location of the injuries tells a different story. Many of these blows are on the top or back of the head. In face-to-face combat, you get hit in the face or the forehead. A blow to the back of the head implies the victim was turning away, fleeing or crouching. Or they were being struck by someone dominating them from a standing position. This is the forensic signature of domestic or capture-based conflict. Let's look at the Neanderthal specimen from Saint-Césaire in France. This skull shows a massive healed fracture from a sharp implement. The individual survived the blow. While we cannot determine the gender of every fragmented fossil with 100% certainty, the pattern across the board in early human sites indicates that women absorbed a high volume of non-lethal trauma. This suggests a society where violence was a daily method of control. Evolutionary psychologists have debated this for years. Some models suggested that aggressive males, the fierce warriors, were the most successful at passing on genes. This would incentivize violence against women as a reproductive strategy. However, modern data flips this. Studies on extant hunter-gatherer tribes, like the Warani in the Amazon, show that the most aggressive warriors, the ones who eliminated the most people in raids, actually had lower survival rates for their children. Why? Because of revenge cycles. If you are too violent, your enemies come back and target your family. So, the violence we see in the female skulls might not be evolutionary success. It might be evolutionary failure. It represents the chaos of a society where the rule of law did not exist. The battered skulls are silent witnesses. They tell us that for a woman in the Pleistocene, the threat didn't just come from the cave lion outside. It came from the person holding the club inside the cave. But before we judge them as complete monsters, we have to look at the other side of the coin, the evidence that proves they were also capable of deep, complex emotions. The crazy part is trying to reconcile this brutality with their intelligence. If Neanderthals were just mindless beasts, the violence would make sense. But the archaeology proves they were sophisticated. At the Krapina site in Croatia, the same place where we found the processed bones, we also found something beautiful. Eagle talons. These were not just leftovers from a meal. The white-tailed eagle is a majestic, hard-to-catch bird. The talons found at Krapina had distinct cut marks and smoothing. They were modified to be strung on a cord. They were making jewelry. This is massive. To make jewelry, you need symbolic thought. You need to understand the concept of self and beauty. You need to value the eagle not just for meat, but for its power or its aesthetic. Neanderthals adorned themselves. They had culture, and they had compassion. Remember Maberman, the individual with the crushed skull who survived? He could not have survived alone. He would have been dizzy, likely blind in one eye, and unable to hunt. He would have been dead weight. But his group fed him. They protected him. They nursed him back to health. We see this at Shanidar Cave too. Shanidar 1 was an old Neanderthal male. He was blind in one eye, had a withered arm, and walked with a limp. He lived for decades with these disabilities. His tribe took care of him. This creates a terrifying paradox. The same beings who could gently nurse a disabled elder or craft a necklace from eagle claws were also capable of the calculated elimination and utilization of their neighbors. It highlights that violence and culture evolve together. The dark side and the light side are not separate. They are entangled. The cooperation required to heal Maberman is the same cooperation required to organize a raid on Nataruk. Sapiens eventually won the war for the planet. We had better tech, the projectile weapons. We had larger numbers. We pushed the Neanderthals into the mountains and eventually into extinction. But in doing so, we absorbed their DNA and, arguably, their capacity for both extreme violence and extreme care. The shadows of the past are long. The exo-cannibalism, the coercion, the warfare. It wasn't an anomaly. It was the forge that shaped us. We have looked at the bones and the weapons, but there is one final piece of evidence, the art on the cave walls, that shows exactly how they viewed this violence themselves. So, Does knowing that our ancestors were capable of such calculated cruelty change how you see modern humanity? Are we really that different from the warriors at Nataruk? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to see the visual evidence of these ancient battles, make sure to like and subscribe for part 3. Everyone is obsessed with the idea that early humans lived in small, peaceful tribes. Basically, we want to believe that war is a modern mistake. But the archaeology of defense says otherwise. In northern Iraq, dating back 10,000 years, we find the foundations of forts. In Anatolia, we find massive walls built 5,000 years before Christ. You don't build a fort to protect yourself from bears. You build a fort to protect yourself from other people. These structures are the ultimate proof that fear was the dominant emotion of the prehistoric world. And that fear drove us to build the first war machines. So, here's the deal. When we look at skeletal trauma, like the hole in the skull at Nataruk, we have to infer what happened. We act like detectives. But sometimes, the ancients made it easy for us. They drew pictures of the crime, traveled to Tassili Najar in Algeria. This is a massive plateau in the Sahara. Today, it is a desert. But between 4,300 and 2,500 BC, it was a savanna. And the people living there were obsessed with archery. The rock art here is specific. We see groups of figures. They are not standing alone. They are organized into lines or clusters, and they are holding bows. But here is the catch. The targets are not animals. The targets are other groups of figures. The paintings depict projectiles flying between opposing sides. This is crucial. It confirms that ranged warfare was a standard tactic. As we discussed in part 1 with the invention of the projectile, the ability to eliminate threats from a distance changed the game. The art at Tassili visualizes this. It shows coordination. You see flankers. You see skirmish lines. This implies leadership. You do not get a line of archers firing in sync without a commander. What most people don't realize is that this art destroys the skirmish theory. For years, anthropologists thought early fights were just messy brawls. Tassili proves they were battles. They had structure, they had tactics, and the dates align perfectly with the rise of competition for resources. As the Sahara began to dry up, water became scarce. The art shows us the result: organized violence to secure the last green lands. But while the African art shows the battle, a cave in Spain shows what happened to the losers after the fighting stopped, drawing the death sentence. Spain, 5000 BC, the Remedios Cave. The art style here is known as Levantine art. It is dynamic and full of movement, but one scene stands out, and it is nightmare fuel. The painting depicts a group of archers. They are raising their bows, but they are not aiming at a charging enemy. They are aiming at a figure that is standing still. The interpretation is controversial but widely accepted by experts. This is an execution. The victim is isolated. The archers are positioned as a squad. This is not the heat of battle. This is the cold, calculated removal of a prisoner or a criminal. This implies a social hierarchy. To execute someone, you need authority. You need a society that understands concepts like punishment or ritual sacrifice. It matches the forensic evidence we saw at Nataruk with the bound woman. The Remedios art confirms that binding and executing captives was a visual trope, something so common they felt the need to paint it. And get this, the detail in the weapons is precise, the bows are drawn to specific lengths, the arrowheads are depicted clearly. These artists were obsessed with the technology of death. It suggests that violence was a central pillar of their culture. It wasn't something they hid. It was something they celebrated on the walls of their sacred spaces. Executions are bad enough, but in China, they found a site where the bodies were not just eliminated but dismantled in a very specific way. Now let's move to Handan, China. The date is roughly 2400 BC. This is the late Neolithic, bordering on the early Bronze Age. Civilization is starting to form, and with it, organized terror. Archaeologists at Handan uncovered something that looks like a scene from a grim movie. They found pits, but these pits were not filled with grain or pottery. They were filled with skulls, cranial piles. The bodies were often missing or found in separate pits. This tells us a few things instantly. First, the method of death or post-mortem processing involved removal of the head. This takes time. In the chaos of a battle, you eliminate the threat and move on. To remove a head requires control of the field. You have to win the battle, then go around to the bodies and systematically process them. Second, the piling suggests a display. In many ancient cultures, heads were trophies. They were counted to prove valor, or they were piled up to intimidate the enemy. Look what we did to these guys. You are next. This aligns with the exo-cannibalism theories from Goyet and the tongue removal from El Cedron. The body of the enemy was not treated as a person. It was an object, a trophy, a resource. The Handan site bridges the gap between the raw, survivalist violence of the Neanderthals and the organized, ritualistic warfare of early civilizations. It shows the industrialization of death. And that's putting it lightly. The sheer number of skulls implies a massacre of significant scale. This wasn't a family feud. This was an army wiping out a village. With all this violence, arrows, executions, ritual displays, humans had to come up with a solution to stay alive, and that solution changed the landscape forever. The best evidence for war isn't always a weapon. It's a wall. If the world was peaceful, you would sleep in the open. You would build your camp wherever the water was. But the archaeological record shows a sudden, desperate shift in housing strategy. In northern Iraq, dating back 10,000 years, we find the foundations of enclosed structures. These are not just houses. They are defensive positions. They are built on high ground. They have restricted entry points. You don't build a house with one tiny door and thick walls unless you are worried about who is knocking. Fast forward to 5000 BC in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. We start seeing massive fortification walls. These are engineering marvels. They required hundreds of people to build. Think about the labor cost. To build a stone wall around your village, you have to stop hunting. You have to stop gathering. You have to dedicate thousands of man-hours to moving rocks. No society does that unless the threat is existential. The existence of these walls proves that raiding parties, like the ones that destroyed Nataruk, were a constant global threat. The landscape was a danger zone. Basically, the invention of architecture was driven by the need to not get attacked in your sleep. And here's the crazy part. The design of these early forts often includes baffle gates or choke points. These are specific tactical designs meant to slow down an attacking force so you can throw spears at them from above. This connects back to the Sapiens' advantage, ranged weapons. The wall allows you to use your projectile advantage while staying safe. It is the ultimate evolution of the distance equals safety rule we discussed in part 1. But while walls protected the living, the tools used to breach them, and the people who made them, were driving a much larger extinction event across the globe. We need to circle back to the weapon that made all this possible, the knockout punch mentioned in the source material. In South Africa, dating back 71,000 years, we find bladelets. These are small, heat-treated stone flakes. They look insignificant, tiny pieces of rock, but they are the prehistoric equivalent of high-velocity ammunition. Before bladelets, you had to find a big rock and shape it into a big spear tip. It was heavy and resource-intensive. Bladelets are efficient. You can make dozens from a single core. You attach them to a lightweight shaft using glue and twine to make arrows or light throwing spears. This technology allowed Homo sapiens to project force over a massive area with very few resources. This is how we displaced the Neanderthals. It wasn't always a dramatic battle like in a movie. It was a logistical squeeze. Sapiens could take down more game from further away. We could risk conflict with Neanderthals because we could hit them from 50 yards while they had to get close. Over thousands of years, this technological asymmetry forced Neanderthals into marginal lands. We pushed them out of the best hunting grounds. We pushed them into the mountains, and there they starved. The violence we see in the bones, the Shanidar 3 rib wound, is the direct result of this bladelet technology. That wound was likely caused by a light, high-velocity projectile, a bladelet-tipped weapon. So, the extinction of the Neanderthals wasn't an accident. It was a slow-motion military campaign fueled by superior engineering. We didn't just outthink them, we out-manufactured them. Now that we have the weapons, the walls, and the bodies, we have to ask the final question: how do we know any of this is real and not just a story? The paintings in Algeria and the skulls in China leave no room for doubt. Our history is written in blood and stone, but science is finally catching up to the oral histories. Bioarchaeology is stripping away the myths and showing us the raw, unfiltered reality of our past. If you think the evidence can't get any darker, you are wrong. Join us for part 4, where we will dive into the final verdict of the fossil record. Smash like, subscribe, and let me know. Would you have survived in 5000 BC? Starvation politics. We have talked about eating people for food, but there is another type of consumption mentioned in the archives. Endocannibalism. This is eating your own family. It sounds like a nightmare, but for Neanderthals, it might have been an act of love or grief. The cut marks on the bones at Krapina debate this distinction. Were they cleaning the bones to bury them or to feast? The difference comes down to microscopic scratches. And getting this right changes everything we know about Neanderthal religion. Here is the deal. Sometimes the most horrific act is actually a misunderstood ritual. So here's the deal regarding the environment. We cannot talk about the violence at Jebel Sahaba without talking about the weather. The source material explicitly links the 58 skeletons found there to Nile floods causing scarcity. This is crucial context. Between 12,000 and 14,000 years ago, the climate in North Africa was swinging wildly. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the only lifeline. When it flooded unpredictably, it wiped out the local ecology. The tubers didn't grow. The game animals moved away. Suddenly, you have multiple groups of Homo sapiens crammed into a shrinking habitable zone. The result was the massacre we see in the bones. Almost half the population died violently. This proves that prehistoric war wasn't about ideology or religion. It was about calories, and that's putting it lightly. The pressure was so intense that they couldn't afford to let anyone go. They eliminated women and children because every extra mouth was a threat to the tribe's survival. This destroys the idea that primitive humans lived in balance with nature. When nature turned on them, they turned on each other. The environmental pressures mentioned in the text were the catalyst for the cruelty. We see this same pattern in Europe with the Neanderthals during the glacial cycles. As the ice sheets moved south, the habitable land shrank. Neanderthals and Sapiens were pushed into the same valleys. The overlapping territories led to the clashes we discussed in part 1. It is a simple, brutal rule of history. When the map gets smaller, the wars get bigger. But while scarcity explains war, it doesn't explain why some groups ate their enemies while others ate their friends. We need to get specific about the types of consumption. The source material makes a key distinction between endocannibalism and exocannibalism. Exocannibalism is what happened at Goyet, part 1. That is eating outsiders. It is aggressive. It is nutritional. It is utilizing the enemy to destroy them. Endocannibalism is different. This is eating or processing members of your own group. At Krapina cave in Croatia, this debate has raged for decades. We found hundreds of bones. They had cut marks, but were they eaten or were they defleshed for burial? Here is the catch. In some cultures, you cannot bury a body with flesh on it. The flesh is seen as corrupt, so you use stone tools to strip the meat off the bones to purify them. The microscopic analysis at Krapina shows cut marks that are ambiguous. They are not specifically targeted at the brain case in the way you would expect if you were just trying to get the most calories quickly. However, the warm period's data from Krapina rules out famine. They weren't starving, so if they were consuming them, it was a choice, a cultural choice. But at Moulin-Guercy in France, the verdict is darker. There, 100,000 years ago, the cut marks on Neanderthals were identical to the cut marks on deer. They shattered the long bones to get the marrow. This suggests that for some Neanderthal groups, there was no sacred distinction. A dead body was a dead body. Whether it was grandma or an enemy soldier, the protein was too valuable to waste. This utilitarian view of the human body is something modern society can't wrap its head around. But in the Pleistocene, sentimentality was a luxury they couldn't always afford. Speaking of luxuries, the idea that the violent alpha male was the ultimate winner of evolution turns out to be a complete myth. Everyone is obsessed with the alpha male theory. We think that in the violent past, the guy who eliminated the most enemies got the most wives and had the most kids. It makes sense on paper. But the data from the Waorani tribes, cited in our investigation, flips this upside down. The Waorani are a modern hunter-gatherer group in the Amazon with very high rates of violence. Anthropologists tracked the zealous warriors, the guys who were the most aggressive in raids. And get this, these badass warriors did not have more surviving children. In fact, they often had fewer. Why? Because violence is a cycle. If you end someone's brother, they come back to end you. And they don't just end you, they target your family. The feuds mentioned in the text are multi-generational. So while the aggressive warrior might get a lot of social status in the moment, he becomes a target. His life expectancy drops. His children's safety drops. This reveals a fascinating evolutionary check on violence. If everyone was a psychopath, the tribe would die out. Natural selection actually favored cooperation amid conflict. You needed guys who could fight, yes, but you also needed guys who could de-escalate. You needed diplomacy. The Maberman Survivor Part 1 proves this. He was injured and couldn't fight, but he was kept alive. If the tribe only valued badass warriors, they would have left him to pass away. The fact that they healed him shows that they valued something else, perhaps his knowledge, his relationships, or his wisdom. Basically, being a monster was useful for the group, but it was often a mission that ended the individual's genetic line. While the warriors were fighting and perishing, the Neanderthals were slowly being pushed into a geographical corner they couldn't escape. We have to look at the map. The source material covers the period from 300,000 to 40,000 years ago. This is the final countdown for the Neanderthals. The overlapping territories mentioned were not static, they were moving. As Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa and into Europe, we didn't just walk into empty land. We walked into Neanderthal living rooms, but we had the Bladelet technology, Part 3, and higher population densities. The archaeological sites show a pattern of displacement. Neanderthal sites in the open lowlands, the good hunting grounds, start to disappear. They are replaced by sapien sites. Neanderthals retreat to the marginal lands, the mountains of Spain, like El Cedron, the caves of Croatia, high altitudes, difficult terrain. This is a classic refugee scenario. In these isolated pockets, resources were even scarcer. This likely increased the survival cannibalism we see at places like El Cedron. They weren't just consuming each other because they were monsters. They were eating each other because they were under siege. They were cut off from the migration routes of the bison and reindeer. The genetic admixture, the 1 to 4% DNA, likely happened on these frontiers. In the chaos of displacement, interactions, both violent and X-rated, occurred. But geography is destiny. You cannot survive in the high mountains forever during an ice age. The sapiens held the valleys, the Neanderthals held the peaks, and eventually the cold and the hunger took them. The violence we see in the bones is the result of a species fighting with its back against the wall. The Neanderthals are gone, but the behaviors that destroyed them and saved us are still very much alive in our modern brains. So, what is the final verdict? The text states clearly, dark behaviors stemmed from survival pressures, shaping modern human traits like cooperation amid conflict. This is the most important takeaway. The violence wasn't an accident. It was a feature. The cooperation that we prize today, our ability to work in teams, to build cities, to have empathy, evolved because of the conflict. You have to cooperate with your group to survive the raid from the other group. The bioarchaeology gives us the direct evidence. It cuts through the oral histories that might try to make our ancestors look like heroes. The bones tell us that we are the descendants of the survivors. And the survivors were the ones who were willing to do whatever it took. They executed the pregnant woman at Nataruk to erase the enemy's future. They utilized the children at Goyet to secure protein for their own. They threw the spear at Shanidar III to clear the territory. We are here because they did those things. It is uncomfortable. It is dark. But it is the truth. The dark side of the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens isn't just a horror story. It is our origin story. We carry the capacity for the care shown to Maberman and the cruelty shown at Handen. Both are tools in the human survival kit. The question is, which tool do we choose to use today? What most people don't realize is that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we think. The forensic evidence from the Paleolithic proves that when the chips are down, humans are capable of anything. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the darkest corners of prehistory. If you learned something new, hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more high-value history documentaries. Until next time, Anatomy of a Defeat. Everyone wants a happy ending. We want to hear that Neanderthals and humans eventually made peace. But the archaeology doesn't do happy endings. It deals in hard facts. And the fact is, the replacement of Neanderthals by Sapiens took over 5,000 years of overlapping conflict. That is 5,000 years of fear, raids, and territorial disputes. We are going to break down the timeline of this displacement and show you exactly how the dark side of our nature became our greatest survival tool. So here's the deal regarding the combat matchup. We have established that both species were violent, but they were not violent in the same way. This distinction is critical to understanding the outcome. Neanderthals were built for high-impact, close-quarters combat. Their anatomy was robust, thick bones, heavy muscle attachments. Their primary weapon, as we discussed, was the heavy thrusting spear. To eliminate a target with a thrusting spear, you have to commit. You have to close the gap. This makes sense for hunting woolly mammoths, where you need massive power. But in a conflict against other humans, it is a liability. Homo sapiens brought a standoff capability. The Bladelet technology from South Africa 71,000 years ago and the subsequent development of the atlatl, spear thrower, allowed sapiens to inflict damage from outside the Neanderthal's engagement zone. Think about the Shanidar 3 injury again. A projectile wound to the rib coming from above with a trajectory consistent with a thrown weapon. This implies that sapiens used hit-and-run tactics. They could harass Neanderthal groups, inflict wounds, and retreat before the Neanderthals could grapple with them. In a long-term conflict spanning thousands of years, this tactical asymmetry is decisive. You don't need to win every fight. You just need to bleed the enemy dry while keeping your own casualties low. The Neanderthals were formidable one-on-one, but sapiens didn't fight one-on-one. We fought from a distance, and we fought in larger groups. And get this. The archaeological record shows that sapiens had higher population densities. We had more troops. So, the dark side wasn't just about cruelty. It was about logistics. We brought an industrial approach to conflict that the Neanderthals, with their smaller isolated groups, simply could not withstand. But winning the war didn't just require better weapons. It required a psychological ability to dehumanize the enemy that we still struggle with today. If you walk into a museum and look at a Paleolithic skull, you are looking at a miracle of survival. But if you look closer, specifically at the markings on the bone found in caves like Goyet in Belgium or El Cedron in Spain, you see something else. You see cut marks. Not the kind made by a lion's tooth or a hyena's jaw. You see precision striations made by stone tools. We have spent decades telling ourselves a comforting story, that prehistoric humans were noble savages, living in harmony until civilization ruined us. But the forensic evidence suggests that the United States of prehistory was actually a theater of absolute horror. Why is it so easy for humans to eliminate other humans? Why do we have a history stained with so much blood? The answer isn't just hate. The answer lies in a terrifying concept called exo-cannibalism. To understand who we are, we have to look at the meat, specifically when people became meat. This is the dark history of how violence became the social glue that held our ancestors together. Let's get one thing straight. Cannibalism in the prehistoric record wasn't always about starvation. Yes, during the glacial maximums, when the reindeer herds moved south and the ice sheets crushed the landscape, hunger was a driving force. But the evidence at Goyet, Belgium, tells a different, more chilling story. The Neanderthal bones found there, dating back around 40,000 to 45,000 years, show clear signs of butchery. They were skinned, filleted, and processed for marrow. But here is the catch. Isotope analysis, the chemical signature of what you eat and where you lived, shows that the victims at Goyet were not locals. They were outsiders. They traveled from a different region, encountered a local group, and were systematically processed. This is exo-cannibalism, the eating of outsiders. This distinction is crucial. It suggests that eating the other wasn't just a meal, it was a statement. It is the root of xenophobia. To eat another person, someone who walks like you, talks like you, and looks like you, you have to perform a massive psychological maneuver. You have to stop seeing them as a person. You have to reclassify them biologically. You flip a switch in your brain that changes their tag from human equal to resource meat. This ability to turn off empathy is a distinct cognitive trait, and honestly, Homo sapiens excelled at it. While Neanderthals certainly practiced cannibalism, as seen at El Cidrón and Mulagirsi, sapiens took us versus them to an industrial scale. This is where the social glue comes in. To keep a large group of people together, you need more than just friendship. You need a common enemy. The violence against Neanderthals, and against other sapiens groups, wasn't a malfunction of society, it was the binding agent. Evolutionary psychologists argue that our cooperation is the flip side of our aggression. We are incredibly loving, altruistic, and loyal to the people inside our circle because we are incredibly ruthless to the people outside of it. The deeper the hate for the them, the stronger the bond for the us. This psychological hardening is what allowed us to survive the Pleistocene, but it left a scar on our psyche that we still haven't healed. Neanderthals lived in small, tight-knit family groups. Their social circles were likely limited to people they knew personally, a concept known as the Dunbar number, which suggests humans can only maintain stable relationships with about 150 people. But Homo sapiens did something radical. We invented fictive kinship. This is the ability to treat a stranger as a brother. How? Through symbols, myths, and shared beliefs. If you wear the same beads as me, like the shell beads found at Blombos Cave, or if you worship the same Lion Man totem, you are my brother, even if we don't share DNA. This sounds nice, right? It sounds like the beginning of civilization. But in the context of the Ice Age, it was a weapon. Fictive kinship allowed sapiens to form alliances and armies that vastly outnumbered Neanderthal groups. We know Neanderthals had culture. At Krapina, Croatia, we found eagle talons that were modified to be worn as jewelry 130,000 years ago. This proves they had symbolism. They had feelings. They had an identity. But in the interspecies conflict, those feelings were likely reserved for their own clan. They couldn't scale their empathy. Sapiens could. We could organize a war party of 300 men from different tribes to wipe out a valley. The Neanderthals, living in isolated pockets of 10 or 20, didn't stand a chance against this social technology. This is why we say war is a social tool. It organizes energy. The violence witnessed at Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, dating to roughly 13,000 years ago, is the ultimate proof. This wasn't a bar fight. This was systematic. At Jebel Sahaba, we find dozens of skeletons with flint arrowheads embedded in their bones. Some victims had healed fractures from previous attacks, only to be eliminated in a final assault. This was a multi-generational conflict. The glue that held that tribe together was the perpetual war against their neighbors for the resources of the Nile. If you think dehumanization is too strong a word, let's look at Nataruk in Kenya. Dated to about 10,000 years ago, Nataruk is essentially a crime scene frozen in time. A group of hunter-gatherers was ambushed on the edge of a lagoon, but the details are what keep archaeologists awake at night. Found among the victims was a man who had been restrained. His hands were tied. Let that sink in. You don't bind a lion. You don't bind a gazelle. You bind a human. The evidence of bound prisoners at Nataruk and similar depictions in rock art at Remedia in Spain proves that violence had evolved beyond simple eliminating. It had become performative, the social function of cruelty. Binding a human being is an act of total dominance. It turns a subject into an object. It signals power to your own group. Look what we can do, and terror to the enemy. This is the dark side of prehistory manifesting as a spectacle. It teaches us that war wasn't just about resources, it was about status. The warriors who could inflict this level of control were likely celebrated. They were the heroes of their tribe. We are the descendants of the tribes that were best at this. We are the children of the winners. And the winners were the ones who could look at a bound, terrified human being and feel nothing but triumph. We need to have a difficult conversation about the genetic legacy of this violence. When we analyze ancient DNA, we see a disturbing pattern regarding gender. The source material states, genetic admixture, possibly from coerced interbreeding. That is a polite academic way of describing a nightmare. In the ancient world, women were often viewed as a resource, biologically and economically similar to territory or food storage. The physical evidence backs this up. The depression fractures found on female skulls in the Paleolithic record, blunt force trauma to the head that healed, are the physical receipts of this mindset. These women were beaten, but kept alive. At El Cedron, DNA analysis revealed something fascinating about Neanderthal social structure. The adult males were all closely related, brothers, cousins. The adult females? None of them were related to the men or to each other. This indicates patriarchality. Women moved out of their birth group, men stayed. While this can happen peacefully, in a landscape of total war, it often happens through raiding. When a tribe like the one at Nataruk was wiped out, the men were eliminated. The women were taken. This brings us to the most telling genetic scar. Today, non-African humans carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. But here is the crazy part. We have almost zero Neanderthal Y chromosomes, the paternal line. If the mating was peaceful and equal, we should see Neanderthal fathers and Sapiens mothers, as well as the reverse. But we don't. The genetic record strongly supports a specific dynamic: Sapiens male, Neanderthal female. The male line of the Neanderthals was extinguished. The female line was absorbed. This suggests a scenario of displacement and conquest where Sapiens men impregnated Neanderthal women, likely in the context of captivity, while Neanderthal men were removed from the gene pool entirely. This dark side suggests that coercive control was a systemic part of the interaction between the species. The battered skulls tell a story of resilience. These women survived trauma, displacement, and total cultural collapse. Yet they managed to keep their lineage alive. Alive enough that their genes are inside you right now. The craziest part of this entire investigation is the contradiction that smacks you right in the face. If we only look at the violence, the butchery, and the cracked skulls, we miss exactly half the picture. Because at the exact same time that prehistoric humans were committing these absolute atrocities, they were performing acts of profound, inexplicable tenderness. It is the ultimate paradox of our species. We are capable of dehumanizing an enemy, yet we will starve ourselves to feed a loved one. This duality isn't a bug in our operating system. It is the feature that allowed us to conquer the planet. To understand the monster, you have to understand the caregiver, because in the Pleistocene, they were often the same person. Let's go to China, roughly 130,000 years ago. In the Guangdong province, archaeologists found a skull known as the Maba Man. This wasn't just any fossil. It was a crime scene. The skull shows clear evidence of a massive blunt force trauma to the right temple. We are talking about a blow delivered with such kinetic energy that it depressed the bone and caused a fracture that would have put a modern human in a coma. The weapon was likely a stone club or a heavy projectile. By all laws of nature, the Maba Man should have died right there on the cave floor, passing away from the injury. But here is the twist that baffles scientists. He didn't die. Analysis of the bone regrowth shows that he lived for months, possibly even years, after receiving that skull-crushing injury. The bone healed. The fracture fused back together. Think about the logistics of that for a second. A hunter-gatherer with a traumatic brain injury cannot hunt. He cannot gather. He cannot defend himself against a saber-toothed cat or a rival tribe. He is dead weight. In a calorie-starved world where every scrap of meat meant the difference between life and death, the Maba Man was a resource drain, yet the evidence proves that he survived. This means someone took care of him. Someone in his tribe made the conscious decision to share their food with him while he lay incapacitated. Someone brought him fresh water. Someone kept the fire going to keep him warm and fought off predators while he was defenseless. This represents a level of social welfare that predates civilization by tens of thousands of years. If the Maba Man surprises you, the case of Shanidar I will blow your mind. Discovered in the Shanidar cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraq, this Neanderthal male, affectionately known as Nandi, paints a picture of prehistoric care that is almost heartbreaking. Nandi lived around 45,000 years ago, and physically, he was a total wreck. The forensic analysis of his skeleton reads like the medical chart of a car crash victim. He had suffered a massive blow to the left side of his face that crushed his eye socket, leaving him partially or totally blind in one eye. The trauma likely affected his brain, possibly causing paralysis on his right side. His right arm was withered and useless, the bones shrunken from disuse, and it had been amputated or broken off above the elbow while he was still alive. But that's not all. Nandi also had a deformed foot and walked with a severe, painful limp. He suffered from a degenerative condition that ate away at his joints. In the brutal, unforgiving economy of the Pleistocene, where you had to chase down bison and wrestle mammoths, Nandi was functionally useless. He couldn't run, he couldn't hunt, and he couldn't fight. And yet, the fossil record shows he lived to be an old man, roughly 40 or 50 years old. That is ancient for a Neanderthal. He survived for decades with disabilities that should have eliminated him in a week. The details get even more intimate. His teeth show unusual wear patterns. The front teeth were worn down in a way that suggests he used his mouth as a third hand, likely to grip hides or tools because his arm was gone. But some anthropologists suggest an even deeper level of care. Given his severe injuries and potential lack of motor function, it is highly probable that he couldn't chew tough meat effectively. The wear on his teeth suggests that someone else in his group might have pre-masticated his food for him. Imagine that. Another Neanderthal chewed the tough, fibrous meat of a wild goat or deer, and then fed it to Nandi, mouth to mouth or hand to mouth, to ensure he didn't starve. That is not just survival instinct, that is love. So, how do we reconcile the utilization of remains at places like Coerced, where Neanderthals were processing bones to extract nutrients, with the nursing home care seen at Shanidar? How can the same species be both monster and saint? The answer lies in what sociologists call the social glue. Compassion and cruelty are not opposites in the evolutionary game, they are functional partners. You heal the Maba man because he is yours, he is in-group, he is part of the tribe. You need him, you value him, and his survival strengthens the emotional bond of the group. On the flip side, you eliminate the victim at Nataruk because she is theirs. She is out-group. She represents a threat to your resources, your water, and your offspring. The evolutionary pressure of the Ice Age, the scarcity of the Nile floods, the freezing winds of the steppe, sharpened both instincts simultaneously. To survive, you had to be incredibly loving to your tribe and incredibly ruthless to everyone else. It was a binary existence. If you weren't willing to fight for your group, you died. If you weren't willing to care for your group, the group fell apart, and you died. This evidence proves that Neanderthals possessed deep emotional capacity. They were not the mindless beasts of Victorian cartoons. They felt pain, they felt loss, and they felt empathy. They were just like us. But perhaps their tragedy lies in the scale of that empathy. Anthropological theories suggest that Neanderthal social circles were smaller than those of Homo sapiens. They cared deeply, but for very few people. They couldn't scale their empathy or their cooperation to larger groups. Sapiens, on the other hand, figured out how to cooperate with strangers, how to build coalitions that extended beyond the immediate family. The tragedy of the Neanderthals isn't that they were animals. It's that they were human enough to suffer and love, but not organized enough to win the global war for resources. A nightmare world. When we look back at what we might call the United States of prehistory, or rather the vast, ungoverned world of prehistory, we have to stop romanticizing it. We need to eliminate the myth of the noble savage once and for all, bury it deep, and never let it resurface. It was a nightmare. It was a place where peace was just the temporary, terrifying pause between raids. From the processing tables at Krapina to the piles of skull trophies at Handen, the archaeological evidence is overwhelming and indisputable. Violence was not an anomaly, it was the norm. It was the background radiation of daily life, a constant static of threat that never turned off. But we cannot sit here in our air-conditioned rooms, with full bellies and moral superiority, and judge them by modern standards. They were operating in a reality we can barely comprehend, They were dealing with total environmental collapse. They were living through the last glacial maximum, a global freeze where temperatures plummeted and familiar ecosystems vanished overnight. You have to understand the sheer physical terror of their existence. They were sharing the landscape with apex predators that make modern lions look like house cats. We are talking about the cave lion, a beast significantly larger than a Siberian tiger, capable of dragging a grown man into the dark without making a sound. We are talking about the short-faced bear, a biological tank that could look a 6-foot man in the eye while standing on all 4 legs, and could run as fast as a racehorse. These weren't just animals. They were monsters that hunted humans for sport and sustenance. Our ancestors were fighting for the survival of their species every single day, with zero guarantee that the sun would rise on their tribe tomorrow. The stress levels they operated under would shatter a modern human's mind within a week. The dark side of human nature wasn't a choice. It was a biological necessity hardwired into the brainstem. The consumption we see in the fossil record, the cut marks on human femurs, the cracked skulls, wasn't always ritualistic. We like to tell ourselves it was religious to make it palatable, but often it was purely caloric. It provided the protein and fat necessary to make it through the brutal winters when the mammoth herds migrated south and the plants died. When you are starving in a frozen wasteland, a neighbor isn't a person. They are a walking sack of calories. The wars and massacres weren't about politics or ideology. They were about water rights during megadroughts. The logic was binary and ruthless. If you didn't secure the water hole, your children died of thirst. If you didn't wipe out the neighboring tribe, they would wipe you out and take your territory. It was eliminate or be erased. The weapons they developed were not for show. The spear throwers, the spiked clubs, the flint daggers. These were instruments of horrific efficiency designed to puncture organs and shatter bone. The atlatl didn't just throw a spear, it launched a projectile with the kinetic energy of a .45 caliber bullet. When archaeologists find a spine with a flint point embedded in the vertebrae, it tells a story of a fleeing victim struck from behind. This wasn't honorable combat, it was execution. Violence was the tool that secured the future. We are here today, sitting in comfortable chairs, watching YouTube on high-speed internet, solely because our ancestors did the dirty work. We are the direct genetic beneficiaries of their brutality. The peaceful lineages, the ones who wanted to talk it out, they died out. The ones who refused to fight, they were erased from the gene pool, their DNA terminating in a bloody dead end. We are the sons and daughters of the survivors, the ones who were willing to do whatever it took to keep breathing for one more day. Look at the sites like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, famously known as Site 117. We are talking about a cemetery that is 14,000 years old. Do you know what they found? Dozens of bodies, men, women, and children. Over half of them had flint arrowheads embedded in their bones or showed signs of fatal blunt force trauma. Many had healed fractures from previous attacks, meaning they had been beaten, survived, and then beaten again until they died. This was a massacre. This was a systematic elimination of a competing group. And this is just one site. Multiply this by thousands of unrecorded skirmishes across the globe, over tens of thousands of years. The silence of prehistory is actually a scream. Then, consider the Neanderthals. They are gone, and that fact alone should chill you to the bone. They fought hard. They had bigger brains than us in some cases. They possessed immense physical strength. A Neanderthal male could probably bench press a modern Olympian without breaking a sweat. Their bones were thicker, their muscle attachments more robust. They were built for close-quarters combat with megafauna. They cared for their sick. We have found skeletons of Neanderthals who were crippled and toothless but survived for years, meaning someone chewed their food for them. They buried their dead with flowers. They made art on cave walls. They were human in every way that matters emotionally. But in the zero-sum game of the Pleistocene, they lost. Sapiens won. And in winning, we inherited the Earth. How did we do it? We didn't hug them into submission. We took their territory. We outcompeted them for food, and in many cases, we likely exterminated them. We had better projectile weapons, allowing us to eliminate from a safe distance, while they relied on thrusting spears that required them to get close. We had tighter social networks, allowing us to swarm them with numbers. It was a slow-motion genocide that took thousands of years. The history of the world isn't a fairy tale of cooperation. It is a grim chronicle of displacement and survival. Every acre of land on this planet has been soaked in blood at some point. This is the heavy truth of our origins. The capacity for extreme violence and extreme compassion is written into our DNA. It is the legacy of the Ice Age. The same hand that could perform delicate surgery or paint a masterpiece is genetically identical to the hand that wielded a rock to crush a rival's skull. We have the potential to be Shanidar, caring for the weak and the broken. And we have the potential to be Nataruk, eliminating the innocent for a patch of fertile ground. Recognizing this isn't about being pessimistic. It's about being honest. It's about looking into the mirror and seeing the predator staring back. The prehistoric world was a forge that hammered us into what we are. It was bloody, it was cruel, and it was terrifying. It stripped away everything that wasn't essential for survival. But it was also the crucible where human resilience was born. We survived the nightmare. We walked out of the ice and the darkness. But we must never forget that the monsters and the caretakers of prehistory are still alive, right there inside of us. When you see road rage or panic buying during a crisis, or the mob mentality take over, you are seeing the programming of the Pleistocene reactivating. We are not fallen angels, we are risen apes, and the climb was slippery with blood. To understand where we are going, we have to stop lying about where we came from. We came from the cold, the dark, and the hunger, and we are the only ones left standing because we were the most dangerous thing in the forest.